"You can keep your bread," Clara said, her voice flat and cold, as the October wind cutting through the doorway. "But don't you dare come back here thinking kindness is the same thing as an invitation." The man on her porch didn't flinch, didn't apologize. He just looked at her with those steady gray eyes like she hadn't said anything at all, like he'd heard worse from kinder women, and tucked his hat back under his arm. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll be back tomorrow." And God help her he was. If this story already has your heart hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this little bakery in Wyoming has traveled. Clara Whitmore had not sung in 14 months. She knew the exact number because she had counted them the way a person counts the days after a surgery, not from hope, but from the need to mark that something terrible had happened, and that she was, in spite of everything, still standing on the other side of it. 14 months since Thomas died. 14 months since she had stood in the back of the Ridgeview Methodist Church in the dress she'd bought for their 5th anniversary and listened to Pastor Hale say words that made no sense to her words, like at peace and better place, and God's plan, while she held her own hands because there was no one left in the world who knew how she liked to be held. 14 months of mornings that came anyway, whether she wanted them to or not. The bakery had saved her. Not in the way people said things saved them, not spiritually, not dramatically. It saved her the way a mop bucket saves a flooded kitchen. Practical. Necessary. Something to do with her hands before the silence got loud enough to do damage. She had opened Whitmore's Bakery 3 years before Thomas died with his encouragement and his savings, and his absolute unshakable belief that her sourdough was the finest thing produced in the state of Wyoming. She had laughed at him for saying that. She missed that laugh now more than she could say out loud. Every morning, she was up before 4. Flour, water, salt starter. The routine was the rope she held onto. She measured and kneaded and shaped and slid loaves into the oven with the kind of practiced care that had become muscle memory. And for the 2 hours before the town woke up, she did not have to think about anything except the bread. She did not sing anymore. She hadn't even noticed she'd stopped until Margaret Hale, the pastor's wife, the town's most cheerful keeper of other people's business, had remarked on it one Tuesday morning in August. "You used to hum when you worked," Margaret had said, peering over the counter with that look of soft, relentless concern. "Your grandmother's songs. I used to hear you from the sidewalk." Clara had handed her the bag of dinner rolls without answering. She was not going to perform her grief for Margaret Hale or anyone else. The morning Ethan Cole walked up her porch steps was the second Friday of October, and Clara was in the middle of the worst part of her week. She always dreaded Fridays. Friday was when the bills came due, the ones she couldn't defer anymore, the ones that required her to sit at the small desk in the back room and do math that never came out right. The flour supplier had raised his prices in September. The wood stove needed a new flue pipe before winter hit. And the Ridgeview savings and loan was already 2 months into the patience it had promised her when Thomas's medical debts had been transferred to her name. She had just burned the first batch of morning rolls. She never burned anything. The burning had startled her so badly she'd knocked the cooling rack off the counter and stood there in the middle of her kitchen floor with flour on her apron, and the bitter smell of scorched bread filling the room, and something cracking open behind her sternum that she absolutely refused to call crying. She was not crying. She was angry. There was a difference, and she insisted on it. She had cleaned up the mess, started the second batch, and was standing at the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands when she heard the boots on the porch. Heavy, unhurried, one step at a time, like someone who was tired but had learned not to show it in the pace. She set down the coffee and went to the door. The man standing on the other side of the screen was not anyone she recognized. Ridgeview was small enough that she knew every face in a 10-mile radius, which meant this man was from somewhere else, somewhere far enough away that the road had put its marks on him. He had dust on his coat and a 2-day beard and eyes that were an odd shade of gray, the kind that looked darker when the sky was overcast, and the sky that morning was very overcast indeed. He was holding his hat in both hands. "Ma'am." His voice was low and even, the kind that didn't waste anything. "I apologize for the early hour. I could smell your bread from the road. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and I'd be grateful if you had anything to spare. I can pay." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had been looked at with pity for 14 months. She had been offered casseroles and Bible verses and carefully worded inquiries about whether she was managing all right. She had been treated like a wound that the town hadn't figured out how to bandage yet. This man was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a bakery sign, straightforward. No agenda, just hungry. She pushed the screen door open. "Wait here," she said. She went back to the kitchen, wrapped yesterday's sourdough loaf in brown paper, and brought it back to the door. She handed it through the screen without ceremony. "I don't need payment," she said. "It's yesterday's bread." He took it with both hands. Yesterday's bread is better than no bread at all. He looked at the package for a moment, then back at her. "Thank you. I mean that." "You're welcome." She started to close the door. "You mind if I sit on the step?" he asked. Not pushy, just asking. "I don't want to eat standing in the road." Clara hesitated. She did not know why she hesitated. The sensible thing was to say yes or no and close the door and go back to the second batch of rolls that needed shaping. She did not need a stranger sitting on her porch steps at 6 in the morning when she had a day's worth of work ahead of her and a week's worth of worry already pressing at the back of her skull. "Suit yourself," she said. She went back inside. She told herself she wasn't paying attention. She shaped the rolls. She checked the oven temperature. She wiped down the counter she'd already wiped once. And she did not go to the window more than twice. The third time she went to the window, he was still there sitting on the top step back straight, despite the tiredness she'd clocked in him eating her bread with the quiet, focused appreciation of a man who understood that food was not guaranteed. He ate the entire loaf. When he was done, he sat for another minute, looking out at the empty road, and then he stood and brushed the crumbs from his coat and picked up his hat from the step beside him. He turned toward the door, not to knock again, just to speak through the screen which she had not quite fully latched. "Best bread I've had in years," he said. "Maybe ever." Clara was not at the window. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen holding a bowl of unproofed dough. "I'm not looking for flattery," she called back. A pause, then so quiet she almost missed it. It wasn't flattery. She heard his boots on the steps going down. She heard the gate. She went to the window. He was walking back toward the road, back toward wherever a cowboy walked at 6 in the morning in Ridgeview, Wyoming, with his hat pulled low and nothing but the road ahead of him. She watched him until he turned the corner. Then she went back to her bread. He came back the next morning. She heard the boots at 5:50 and felt something complicated move through her chest that she chose not to examine too carefully. She finished the braid she was working on, wiped her hands, and went to the door. He was standing on the step with a clean shirt and 2 bits in his hand. "I'd like to buy a roll this time," he said. "If you've got them fresh." "I've got them fresh." She looked at the coins in his hand. "That's enough for 2. Then I'll take 2. She bagged them. He paid. He sat on the step again. She had not invited him, and she had not told him not to, which she recognized as a kind of passive permission she hadn't consciously granted. After 5 minutes, she brought her own coffee outside. She didn't know why. The morning air was cold, and her kitchen was warm, and there was no practical reason to stand on her own porch, making conversation with a man she didn't know. She stood near the door with the cup in both hands, not sitting, because sitting would have felt like an invitation, and she was not issuing invitations. "What's your business in Ridgeview?" she asked. Because it was a reasonable question, and because if she didn't ask it, she would spend the day wondering. "Came up from Colorado," he said. "Looking for seasonal work. A spread east of town took me on for the winter coal ranch." He paused. "Different family, not mine. You're a Cole, Ethan Cole." He looked up. "You're Mrs. Whitmore." "How do you know my name?" "It's on the sign." He nodded toward the road-facing side of the building. "Whitmore's Bakery, established 1891. She felt a flicker of something not quite embarrassment, more like the discomfort of being reminded that she was still a character in a town that had a story about her. "Clara," she said after a moment. Not Mrs. Clara. He nodded once. Ethan. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Something was established anyway, not friendship, not yet, but the acknowledgement that they were both people with names and a reasonable amount of caution about how much those names were worth. Toll. He came back Monday. And Tuesday. By Wednesday, Clara had stopped going to the door to see who it was. She just went to the bread box. Hattie Burns, who ran the dry goods store 2 doors down and treated gossip like a second source of income, appeared at Clara's counter on Wednesday afternoon with her usual order of cinnamon loaves and her usual order of other people's news. I hear you've got a regular, Hattie said, wrapping both words in the particular tone she reserved for things she considered mildly scandalous. I've got a customer, Clara said, wrapping Hattie's loaves with perhaps slightly more force than necessary. Ethan Cole, Hattie said, as if testing the name for flavor. Nobody seems to know much about him. Came down from Colorado, I heard. I wouldn't know. Clara? Hattie lowered her voice, which in Hattie's case meant everyone within 15 feet could still hear her clearly. It's only been a year. Clara set the wrapped loaves on the counter with a sound that landed somewhere between a placement and a statement. 14 months, she said. And he's a customer, Hattie. He buys rolls, that's all. Hattie picked up her loaves with the careful, unconvinced expression of a woman who had lived long enough to know that that's all was almost never the end of the sentence. Kyong. The first real conversation happened on Thursday. It started because the axle on his horse threw a shoe just outside town, and Ethan was waiting for the farrier who wouldn't be available until afternoon, and Clara had a pot of coffee and the kind of stubborn, practical hospitality that did not permit a man to stand in a cold wind when there was a warm room available. Come in, she said, holding the door. Coffee's on. She had not had a person sitting at her kitchen table since Margaret Hale had come in September with a casserole and stayed for 2 hours talking about her son's problems with his second wife. Clara had vowed afterward to keep the kitchen table for herself. She set a mug in front of him without asking how he took it. He wrapped both hands around it and was quiet for a moment, and she liked that. She had grown tired of people who could not tolerate silence, people who filled it with noise to avoid having to feel anything. You bake every morning, he asked finally. Every morning, 4 a.m. 7 days. 6. I'm closed Sundays. She paused. Thomas, my husband, he said a person needed one day where they didn't have to be useful to anyone. I keep the Sundays. She hadn't mentioned Thomas's name in conversation in weeks. She noticed the way it came out, not with the weight she usually braced herself for, but matter-of-factly. Like he was just a fact of her life and not an open wound. Ethan didn't react with the wincing sympathy she had come to dread. He just nodded. Smart man, he said. He was. She wrapped both hands around her own mug. He was a very smart man. How long were you married? 11 years. She looked at the table. He got sick 3 years into the bakery. We didn't know at first. By the time we knew, she stopped. 2 years. From diagnosis to... She stopped again. Ethan did not rush her. I'm sorry, he said. Just that. 2 words, no decoration, no pivot to comfort her. What about you? She said, because she needed the conversation to turn. Colorado. What brought you that far north? Something moved across his face, a shadow, quick and controlled. He took a drink of coffee before answering. Work, he said. And some things I needed to put distance between myself and... What kind of things? He looked at her with those steady gray eyes. The kind that don't make for good morning conversation. Fair enough, Clara thought. She had her own things like that. He was back Friday morning, rolls and payment, and the step the same as always. But when she brought her coffee out, she sat down. Not near him. She took the chair by the door. But she sat. He looked at her, just a glance quick and unremarkable, and said nothing about it. They sat in the cold morning air with their coffee and the smell of fresh bread drifting out from inside, and the town of Ridgeview beginning to stir itself awake at the end of the road, and nothing needed to be said about the fact that something had shifted quietly without either of them making a decision about it. It was on the following Tuesday that Clara found the letter. She had been avoiding the desk in the back room for 3 days, the way she sometimes avoided it when she suspected the news inside would require more strength than she currently had available. But the envelope from Ridgeview Savings and Loan had a "Please respond" immediately stamp on it, and she could no longer pretend she hadn't seen it. She read it once standing up. Then she sat down and read it again. The bank was calling in Thomas's medical debts. The deferment period had ended. She owed $412, and she had 60 days to produce it, or the bank would move to seize assets, which in her case meant the building. The building that housed the bakery. The building that was the bakery. She set the letter on the desk and stared at the wall. $412. She had $37 in her cash box and another $19 in the bank account. She could stretch the next 2 months of revenue if she cut her own expenses to nothing, if she sold the horse Thomas's brother had left in her care, if she called in the "I owe us" from 2 customers who had owed her since spring. She ran the numbers 3 times. They came out wrong every time. She was on the edge of losing everything Thomas had built with her. Everything she had kept alive, because she could not bear to lose one more piece of him. She pressed both hands flat on the desk and made herself breathe. She did not tell anyone. Not Hattie, not Margaret, not her sister in Cheyenne, who would have immediately arrived with opinions and a solution that involved Clara moving somewhere smaller and giving up on Ridgeview entirely. She told no one, except that Friday, without fully intending to, she told Ethan Cole. Jig. She hadn't meant to. She'd brought out the coffee and sat in the chair by the door and meant to say nothing beyond the polite minimum, but there was something about the way he was sitting. That morning, shoulders dropped, no pretense, just a man drinking coffee in the cold that made her guard slip sideways. "I may have to close," she said. He turned his head slowly. "The bakery. The bank is calling in a debt from when Thomas was sick." She said it flatly, because if she put any feeling into it, she'd have to feel it. "I have 60 days. He was quiet for a moment. "How much?" "More than I have." He turned back toward the road and was quiet for a long moment. She waited for the pity. The how terrible. The "I'm so sorry, is there anything I can do" that people said when they meant "I'm glad this isn't happening to me." "Have you talked to anyone at the bank?" he asked. "Not the letter. A person." "Jasper Webb manages the loans. He's not—" She shook her head. "He's not a cruel man, but he follows the rules." "Rules can be renegotiated," Ethan said. "They just have to be asked the right way. I've never been good at asking." He looked at her then, direct and unhurried the way he did everything. "Neither have I," he said. "But I've gotten better at it." She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what to do with any of this. The coffee on the step, the easy silence, the way he listened without making her feel like her problems were a burden he was generously accepting. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked. The words were out before she'd finished deciding to say them. He tilted his head slightly. "For the bread." "The bread is not that good." "It really is." A pause. "But that's not the only reason." The morning was very cold and very still. In the distance, the Ridgeview church bell rang 7 o'clock. Clara stood up and went inside without answering. But her hands, she noticed when she picked up the next ball of dough, were not quite steady. She told herself that night in the quiet of the house that had not stopped being too quiet in 14 months that she was not interested. She was not available. She was a woman with too much debt and too much history, and not nearly enough of herself left over to offer anyone anything. She told herself this while she lay in the dark, looking at the ceiling. She told herself this with great conviction. And then she thought about the way he'd said, "That's not the only reason," and the whole conviction wobbled at the edges. She hadn't wobbled in 14 months. She hadn't let herself. And now here was this stranger from Colorado with quiet gray eyes, and no apparent interest in making her feel better, who just sat and listened and said true things without dressing them up, and something was moving in the part of herself she'd told to go to sleep. She didn't like it. She didn't like it the way you don't like the first warm day after a long winter, the way that feeling is wrapped in grief for what the cold had meant, for all the things you'd gotten used to telling yourself you didn't need. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She did not sleep well. Saturday morning, 6:15, she heard boots on the step. She was already at the door before she thought about what that meant, that she'd been listening for them, that her body had started tracking that sound without her permission. She pushed the screen door open. Ethan had two things with him: his usual coins for the rolls, and in his other hand, a folded piece of paper. "What is that?" she asked. "I spent some time at the land office yesterday afternoon," he said, "looking at the county records. Your deed and your loan are structured in a particular way. There's a legal mechanism that lets you renegotiate the terms if you can demonstrate active commercial operation." He held out the paper. "I wrote down the statute number and the argument you'd need to make to Jasper Webb." Clara stared at the paper. Then she looked up at him. "You went to the land office," she said slowly, "to look at my deed." "I did." "Why?" He met her eyes steadily. "Because you shouldn't lose this place." Something hard and defended moved in Clara's chest. Her throat tightened. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." "I don't need—" She stopped, restarted. "I am not a project, Mr. Cole. I am not something to be fixed up and sent on my way. I've managed 14 months on my own, and I don't need— Clara." His voice was quiet, not cutting her off, just placing her name in the space between them. "I'm not trying to fix you. I went to the land office because I know a little about property law, and you mentioned a problem, and I had a free afternoon. That's all it was." She looked at the paper in his outstretched hand. $412, 60 days. Everything Thomas had built. Her hand shook slightly as she took the paper from him. She unfolded it. He had written clearly in the careful hand of someone who'd spent years writing things that needed to be readable in bad conditions. Field notes, supply lists, the kind of records you kept when mistakes were expensive. The argument was sound. She could see that even before she'd read it fully. It was the kind of thing she should have known to look for, and hadn't, because she'd been too close to her own fear to think strategically. "You can keep your bread," she said quietly. Her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be. "But don't you dare come back here thinking kindness is the same thing as an invitation." The words surprised her even as they came out. They were the right words, the self-protective words, the words that kept the walls standing, but they came out shaking slightly, and Ethan heard the shaking. He didn't step back from it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll be back tomorrow." He touched the brim of his hat and walked back down the steps. Clara stood in the doorway with the paper in her hand and watched him go and felt the wobble settle into something she had no name for yet, something that wasn't hope exactly and wasn't fear exactly, but lived somewhere in the complicated territory between the two. She looked down at the paper. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket and went back inside to finish the morning bread. The second batch of rolls came out perfect. She did not notice until she was sliding them onto the cooling rack that she was humming, low and quiet, one of her grandmother's songs. She stopped the moment she realized it. But the silence afterward didn't feel as empty as it had for the past 14 months. It felt very tentatively like something had shifted. She went to the bank on Monday. She had spent Sunday her day, Thomas's rule, the one piece of the week she kept sacred, reading Ethan's notes 3 times and arguing with herself about whether to use them. Not because the argument wasn't sound. It was. She'd looked up the statute herself in the county record book she kept in the back room, the one Thomas had bought when they were fighting the property line dispute with their neighbor Gus Farley 3 years before he got sick. The statute was exactly where Ethan said it would be. The argument was exactly as clean as he'd written it. She went back and forth not because of the law. She went back and forth because of what it meant to walk into Jasper Webb's office with a solution she hadn't found herself. She had built a point of pride out of managing alone. It was not a healthy pride, she knew that. Margaret Hale had said as much gently in the way Margaret said most things. "You don't have to carry it all yourself, Clara." And Clara had nodded and said of course not, and gone right back to carrying it all herself, because the alternative was admitting that she couldn't, and she was not ready to admit that. But $412 had a way of moving a person past their pride. She put on the good blouse, the dark blue one she'd worn to the bank when she and Thomas had first applied for the business loan, the one she kept for occasions that required her to be taken seriously. And she walked down Main Street at 9 in the morning and pushed open the door of Ridgeview Savings and Loan before she could talk herself out of it. Jasper Webb was a lean, careful man of 50-something who had been at that desk for 20 years and had the particular stillness of someone who had heard every variation of financial desperation and had learned to remain unmoved by all of them. He looked up when Clara came in, and something moved briefly across his face, not unkindness, just the practiced neutrality of a man who needed to stay neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I was expecting to hear from you. I imagine you were." She sat down without being asked and set Ethan's notes on the desk between them. "I'd like to discuss a renegotiation under Section 14B of the Wyoming Property Loan Act of 1887. Jasper looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "Does it matter?" A pause. He picked up the paper. He read it the way he read everything, slowly, thoroughly, giving nothing away. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and kept her breathing even. The clock on the wall ticked 9 times while he read. "This is a legitimate argument," he said finally. "I know it is." He set the paper down. "Clara." He only used her first name when the conversation was about to become human rather than procedural. "The bank doesn't want your building. You understand that this isn't personal." "I understand that. But the terms of the loan were clear, and the deferment period has ended." "Yes, I read the letter." She leaned forward slightly. "Jasper, I have operated a continuous commercial business in this building for 3 years. Thomas's debt is structured as a personal liability, but the business asset is legally distinct under the statute. You have the authority to restructure the repayment over 36 months. I'm asking you to do that." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, through the frosted glass partition, she could hear the low murmur of the teller counting coins. $14 a month, he said at last. 36 months. No deferments, no extensions. $14 a month, she repeated. "I can do that. You'll need to sign amended paperwork by end of week. I'll be here Thursday." She stood. She shook his hand. She walked back out onto Main Street and stood in the cold October air and let herself feel it, the loosening of something that had been wound tight for weeks, the particular relief of a crisis averted that felt nothing like happiness, but a great deal like survival. She was still standing there when Hattie Burns materialized at her elbow with the unerring instinct of a woman who sensed significant moments from half a block away. "Well," Hattie said. "Well, what? You came out of that bank looking like a person who just won a hand of cards." "I came out of that bank looking like a person who had a business meeting." Hattie narrowed her eyes. "Did the cowboy help you?" Clara turned to look at her. "Excuse me. Don't excuse me. Hattie lowered her voice to her idea of a whisper, which was still audible to anyone within a generous radius. "Roy Keller works at the land office. He told me that a man matching Ethan Cole's description spent 2 hours in there Friday afternoon looking through county records. Roy said he was asking specifically about the Whitmore property deed." Hattie raised her eyebrows. "So I'll ask again. Did he help you?" Clara looked down the street. A wagon was rolling past. 2 women she knew from the Wednesday market were coming out of the dry goods store. The whole ordinary machinery of Ridgeview grinding along the same as it had ground along yesterday and would grind along tomorrow. "He pointed me in a direction," she said carefully. "I did the rest." "Clara!" Hattie touched her arm, and for once the touch was not curious or acquisitive, but genuinely warm. "That's not nothing." "No," Clara said. "It's not." She went back to the bakery. She didn't tell Ethan when he came Tuesday morning. She handed him his rolls and poured her coffee and sat in the chair by the door and waited, and he ate his rolls and drank whatever he'd brought in his own canteen and didn't ask, which meant either he didn't care how the bank meeting had gone, or he understood that she'd tell him when she was ready and not a moment before. She decided it was the latter. "It worked," she said finally. Around the time the church bell rang 6:30, he looked over. Jasper Webb agreed to restructure the loan, 36 months. She paused. $14 a month. I can manage $14 a month. Ethan turned back toward the road. He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't say "I'm so glad." He just said quietly, "Good." One word, and somehow it landed exactly right. "I owe you a thank you," she said. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you a thank you," she repeated more firmly. "I'm saying it. Thank you, Ethan." He glanced at her then, and for just a moment, the measured steadiness in his face shifted slightly. Something warmer underneath something that looked like it didn't come out very often and wasn't entirely comfortable in the light. "You're welcome, Clara," he said. They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Less careful, less like two people holding their breath. It was Hattie who told her about the rumors first. Not the gentle gossip of, "I see you've got a regular customer," the other kind. The kind with teeth. She appeared at the bakery counter on Wednesday afternoon with no pretense of shopping, which told Clara something significant because Hattie always pretended to be shopping. "There's talk," Hattie said. Clara kept wrapping the sourdough loaves. "There's always talk. This is specific talk about Ethan Cole." Hattie lowered her voice. "Roy Keller's brother-in-law came through from Laramie last weekend. He said there was a man matching Ethan Cole's description who left a ranch near Laramie under bad circumstances earlier this year." Clara's hands stilled. "What kind of bad circumstances?" she said. "The kind involving another man's wife," Hattie said. "Roy's brother-in-law said the rancher who owned the spread name of Dawes Big Property east of Laramie, he ran the hired handoff at gunpoint. Said the man had been pursuing his wife." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara set down the loaf in her hands. "That's hearsay from someone who heard it from someone else," she said. "That's not." "I know what it is," Hattie said. "I'm not saying it's gospel. I'm saying it's what's going around." She reached across the counter and covered Clara's hand with her own. "I'm saying it because you've been through enough, and I'd rather you hear it from me." After Hattie left, Clara stood at the counter for a long time. She thought about the shadow that had crossed Ethan's face the morning she'd asked about Colorado. Some things I needed to put distance between myself and... She had accepted that at face value, taken it as the kind of vague past that most people carrying around had every right to keep private. But if it was what Hattie was saying, if he had come here from a situation like that, if the steadiness and the listening and the morning coffees were all just a pattern, a way of operating, something he'd done before with someone else's wife in someone else's town. She stopped herself. She was getting ahead of a rumor. That was what rumor did. It built architecture in your mind faster than facts could knock it down. She would not let herself be moved by gossip, but she would not ignore it either. Thursday morning, she did not bring out the coffee. She handed him the rolls through the screen door and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." He looked at her steadily. "All right." "Laramie," she said. Something happened in his face. It was subtle, a slight tightening, the way a man looks when a word lands exactly where he knew someday it would. He didn't flinch away from it. He held it. "What did you hear?" he asked. "I heard you were run off a ranch at gunpoint. I heard it was about a woman." The silence stretched long enough that Clara's heart had time to do something anxious and unhelpful in her chest. "That's not wrong," he said finally. The screen door felt very thin between them. But it's not the whole story, he continued. And I'd like to tell you the whole story. If you'll hear it. Clara looked at him. This man who had shown up on her step hungry and tired and had come back every morning after without being asked. Who had gone to the land office on her behalf without mentioning it. Who had never once looked at her with anything that felt like manipulation. She unlatched the screen door. "Come inside," she said. He sat at her kitchen table, the table she had sworn to keep for herself, and she poured coffee and sat across from him and waited. He took a moment. Not the moment of someone constructing a story. The moment of someone deciding how much truth to tell and choosing more than was strictly required. "Her name was Nora Dawes," he said. "Wife of the man I worked for. I was there 6 months. He stopped. Restarted. She was not happy. That's not an excuse, it's a fact. Dawes was not a good man to her, and she was looking for a way out, and she decided that way was me." "And you?" Clara asked. "I was lonely," he said simply. "I'd been working ranches alone for 3 years at that point, and she was kind, and she paid attention to me, and I let it go further than it should have. We talked, wrote letters. I told myself it wasn't more than that." He looked at his hands. "It was more than that. I knew it was, and I let it happen anyway. When Dawes found out, I didn't argue. I packed my kit, and I walked away from the rifle he had pointed at my back, and I didn't stop moving until I was 2 states north." Clara said nothing. "I'm not proud of it," Ethan said. "I didn't touch her. I want to be clear about that because the story that went around wasn't clear about it. But I knew she was married, and I let her lean on me in a way that wasn't right, and I should have put a stop to it sooner than I did." He looked up. "That's the whole story. You asked for straight, and that's straight." The kitchen was very still. "Why are you telling me?" Clara said. "You could have said it was nothing. You could have let me think the rumor was wrong." "Because it's not entirely wrong." He held her gaze. "And because you deserve to know exactly what kind of man is sitting at your table." Clara turned her coffee cup in a slow circle with both hands. Something in her chest was doing the complicated thing it had been doing for weeks, pushing back against itself, wanting to close and simultaneously prying itself open against her will. "You've been coming here every morning for 3 weeks, she said slowly. "Yes. And She stopped. "I'm a widow, Ethan. I'm not a married woman. There's nothing scandalous about—" "I know that," he said. "I know the situations are different. I'm telling you about Laramie because you need to know who I am, not because I'm comparing you to her." A pause. "You are nothing like her." "What does that mean?" "It means she wanted to be rescued. You don't want to be rescued. You want to be—" He paused, searching for the word with the carefulness of a man who understood words could land wrong. "Seen," he said. "I think that's what you want. To have someone sit across from you and not need you to be smaller than you are." Clara's throat tightened without permission. She stood up and went to the window. "I think you should go," she said. Her voice was not steady. "Okay." He pushed back the chair. He stood. He picked up his hat from the table. "I'm not sending you away because of Laramie," she said without turning around. "I need you to know that." "Then why?" She pressed her lips together. "Because you just said something very accurate about me, and I haven't had anyone do that in a long time, and I need a few minutes alone with it." A pause. "I'll be on the step," he said. "Take whatever time you need." She heard him go to the door and out. She heard the screen door ease shut behind him. She stood at the window and breathed. He was right. That was the thing she couldn't argue with, the thing that had gotten past all her careful management and landed somewhere undefended. She did not want to be rescued. She'd had 14 months of people trying to rescue her in ways that all required her to be less than herself. Less capable, less stubborn, less present, and she had resisted every one of them. Ethan Cole had never once tried to make her smaller. He'd gone to the land office and handed her a tool and let her use it herself. He sat on her step and drank his coffee and didn't fill the silence with noise. He'd just told her something hard about himself, when lying would have been easier. She realized, with the particular cold clarity of a truth you have to sit down with, in a great deal of trouble. She went back outside 10 minutes later. He was where he said he'd be, sitting on the top step, hat resting on his knee, looking out at the road with the patient stillness that she was starting to think was less about personality and more about survival. A man who had learned to wait without it costing him anything. She sat down in the chair. Not the door chair. The step chair. One step above him. He didn't comment on it. "I'm not running you off," she said. "I gathered. But I'm not—" She pressed her palms flat on her knees. "I am not in a position to offer you anything, Ethan. I want to be honest about that. I am a woman with a bakery in debt, and a dead husband's ghost in every room of this house, and I have not figured out yet who I am without the grief. I don't know if I'm even—" She stopped, tried again. "I don't know if there's anything left in me that knows how to—" "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quietly. "Then what are you doing here?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive thinking. She'd learned the difference. "I spent 3 years moving," he said. "Ranch to ranch, town to town. I told myself I liked it. The freedom of it. No roots, no complications, nobody looking at you like they know what you're going to do next." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "But the truth is, I was moving because it was easier than stopping. Stopping means you have to look at where you actually are." He glanced at her. "I stopped here. That's all I know." "Because of the bread," she said dryly. The corner of his mouth moved. "Best bread in Wyoming." "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." Clara looked at him, really looked the way she hadn't let herself look at him directly for 3 weeks, the way she'd been careful to look past him rather than at him. He was tired in a deep way that wasn't about sleep. He had the particular quality of someone who had made a significant mistake and had spent a long time deciding what kind of person to be afterward. She recognized that quality because she saw it in the mirror every morning, the face of someone who had survived something and hadn't yet decided what to do with the survival. "I have to go in," she said. "I've got the afternoon rush in 40 minutes. "I know." He stood with her. They stood on the step together for a moment, closer than they'd stood before, and neither of them stepped back from it. "I'll see you tomorrow morning," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement. Something in between. 6 o'clock, she said. "Rolls are best before 7. He put his hat on and walked down the steps. She watched him go. Then she went inside and buried herself in the afternoon rush, and did not let herself think about any of it until the last customer left and the door was locked, and she was alone with the clean kitchen and the cooling ovens. Then she sat down at the table where he'd sat an hour before and put her head in her hands. Not crying. She wasn't crying, just holding the weight of it. It was Roy Keller who made the first real trouble, not Hattie. Hattie's gossip was the benign kind, the kind that ran on curiosity rather than malice. Roy was a different animal. Roy had a brother-in-law in Laramie and a platform at the barber shop on Saturday mornings, and a deep investment in the social architecture of Ridgeview that made any disruption to it feel like a personal threat. Clara heard about it secondhand, the way she heard most things from Margaret Hale, who appeared Friday afternoon with the tight, apologetic expression of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have. Roy was at Deacon's barbershop this morning, Margaret said, accepting the cup of tea Clara offered because there was no gracious way to refuse. He was talking about what his brother-in-law told him, about Laramie. She wrapped both hands around the cup. He was saying some rather unkind things about you, Clara, about your judgment, about... She paused delicately. He used the word lonely in a way that wasn't kind. Clara felt the heat move up through her chest into her face. He said you were letting a man with a scandal follow you around because you were too lonely to know better. Margaret said it quickly, the way you say a thing when the only mercy is speed. I told him that was a disgraceful thing to say about a woman who had done nothing wrong. Half the room agreed with me. And the other half? Clara asked. Margaret didn't answer. Clara put her teacup down with very careful precision. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to bake bread tomorrow morning," Clara said. Same as always. But something had hardened. She was not angry at Ethan. She'd asked him for the truth, and he'd given it. She was not even fully angry at Roy Keller, who was small-minded in the way many men were small-minded when they saw a woman who didn't need their approval. She was angry at the shape of it. The familiar, exhausting shape of a woman being evaluated by people who had never sat across from her and tried to understand a single thing about her life. She had kept herself small for 14 months out of grief, and then smaller still out of pride, and she was deeply, quietly, fundamentally tired of small. She told Ethan on Saturday morning. Just the facts delivered the way she delivered most hard things, quickly and without decoration. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I'm sorry. That's my history making trouble for you, and I'm sorry for it. It's not your fault Roy Keller has too much time on his hands. Maybe not. But I walked into your life carrying that story, and I knew it would land eventually." He looked at her directly. "If you want me to stop coming, Clara, I will. I mean that. You've got a business to protect and a reputation that matters in this town, and I—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't make that offer unless you mean it," she said. "Because I'll take it if you mean it, and I don't—" She looked away, looked back. "I don't want to take it, I'm telling you that. I don't want you to stop coming." The morning sat around them cold and still and enormous. "Then I won't stop," he said. Clara nodded once, stood up from the step, went to the door, then stopped with her hand on the screen and said without turning around, "Roy Keller has been telling people I'm too lonely to know better. I heard. He's wrong about the too lonely part." She paused. "He's not entirely wrong about the lonely part." She went inside before he could answer, but she heard him through the screen exhale one slow breath, not a laugh, not quite. The sound of a man who'd been holding something carefully and had just been given permission to set it down for a moment. That sound stayed with her through the rest of the morning. It stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit. Sunday came and went, the way Sundays did, quietly, with the particular quality of silence that Clara had come to think of as neither peaceful nor painful. Just empty in a way that had its own texture. She did not see Ethan on Sundays. She had not said that directly. She had simply never opened the door on Sunday, and he had never tested it. That restraint, she thought, said more about him than most things. Monday morning she was up at 4, same as always. But something was different before she'd even touched the flower. She caught herself at the window at 5:40 listening. She turned away from the window with a firmness that was directed entirely at herself. He came at 5:55. She was already at the door. She did not remark on that, and neither did he. "Cold front coming?" he said, settling onto the step. "I heard. Joe Faber at the feed store said it might snow by Wednesday. Early for snow?" "It's Wyoming," she said. "Snow's never early. People are just always surprised." He looked up at her over his shoulder, and the corner of his mouth moved, and she felt the warmth of that small, unguarded thing in a place she was trying very hard to keep guarded. She sat down. One step above him. Same as Saturday. Neither of them mentioned Saturday. Neither of them needed to. It was Tuesday afternoon when the first real consequence of Roy Keller's barbershop performance arrived at her door. Not Roy himself. His wife Edna, a thin, correct woman who had always treated Clara with the distant politeness of someone who considered widows mildly contagious, appeared at the counter just before the afternoon rush ended. She did not ask for bread. She stood at the counter with her gloves still on and looked at Clara with an expression that was trying to be sympathetic and not quite making it. "I want you to know," Edna said, "that I don't agree with everything Roy says." "That's very generous," Clara said. "He can be—" A pause. "He can be excessive. He can be a bully." Edna blinked. That's what he is," Clara said, not with heat, with the flat, tired precision of a woman who was done softening her vocabulary for other people's comfort. He used my name in a public place to say something cruel about my intelligence and my character, because he doesn't like that a stranger is sitting on my porch steps in the morning. That's bullying, Edna. Not gossip. Not excessive. Bullying. Edna stood very still. I'm telling you this, Clara continued, because you came in here and I think you deserve a straight answer as much as anyone. I'm not asking Roy to stop talking about me. Men like Roy stop when they find something more interesting to talk about. I'm just asking you to think about whether you want to keep nodding along. Edna left without buying anything. Clara was not sure she'd handled that well. She was almost entirely sure she didn't care. What she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't know until Hattie appeared Wednesday morning before the bakery had even opened, knocking at the back door with the urgency of a woman carrying news that couldn't wait for business hours, was that Roy Keller had done something considerably worse than talk. He'd written a letter. To Lawrence Dawes, Hattie said, catching her breath. She'd come fast, her coat not fully buttoned. Roy wrote to the rancher in Laramie, told him where Ethan was. Clara felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Why? She said. Roy's brother-in-law told him Dawes had been asking around about Cole since September. Apparently the man never fully let it go. Hattie reached out and gripped Clara's arm. Roy sent that letter 3 days ago, which means if Dawes got it quickly, he could already be on his way, Clara said. Yes. Clara stood very still. Does Ethan know? Not unless someone told him, and I don't think anyone has, because nobody else knew about the letter until this morning. Roy told Deacon at the barber shop in confidence, and Deacon told... Hattie stopped. It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is you need to tell him. Today. Why me? Clara said, and heard immediately how that sounded not as evasion, but as genuine bewilderment. Why is it my responsibility to... Because he comes to your door every morning, Hattie said with perfect simple logic. Because you know him better than anyone in this town does, and because if Lawrence Dawes rides into Ridgeview and finds Ethan Cole without any warning, something very bad could happen, and you would not forgive yourself. Clara took off her apron. Watch the front counter. Absolutely, Hattie said, already going for the counter with the competent eagerness of a woman who had always secretly wanted to run a bakery. She'd never been to the Cole Ranch, spread the one east of town, the one that had hired Ethan for the winter. She asked Joe Faber for directions, and he gave them without asking why, which she appreciated more than she could say. She walked. It was 2 miles, and the cold was genuine, and her boots were not built for cross-country walking, and she did not slow down once. The spread was a working ranch, she could tell by the sound, before she could see the detail, and the man who ran it. A thick-shouldered rancher named Bert Caldwell, who had the permanent squint of someone who spent his life reading wind, was standing by the fence when she came through the gate. He looked at her with the expression of a man presented with something unexpected. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Something wrong. I need to speak with Ethan Cole, she said. It's urgent. He looked at her for a moment more, then put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a whistle that could have knocked birds off a wire. Across the field, a figure turned. She watched him recognize her from that distance, watched the economy of his movement as he set down whatever he'd been doing and came toward the fence with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything which was starting to drive her slightly mad in a way she had not finished examining. He reached the fence and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "No preamble, just straight to the thing," she told him. Quickly and completely the way she'd told him everything without dressing it up. The change in his face was something she'd never seen before. The stillness didn't leave, but something underneath it shifted, a drawing down, a compression, the look of a man running calculations that had nothing to do with mathematics. "When did Roy send it?" he said. 3 days ago. He looked at Bert Caldwell. Something passed between them, the shorthand of men who worked together, who understood each other's trouble. "Take the rest of the day," Bert said. Ethan stepped through the fence gate. They walked back toward town side by side, and Clara noticed that his pace was faster now, not running, but the walk of a man who had been trained by experience to move quickly when the window was still open. "I'm not going to run," he said, not to her, to himself it seemed, testing the statement. I didn't ask you to. I know you didn't, but that's going to be your next question. He glanced at her. You're going to ask if I want to leave before Dawes gets here. Do you? A long pause. 3 years ago I would have. I would have had my kit packed in 20 minutes and been on a horse before you got back to your bakery. He said it with the flat honesty she'd come to expect from him. That's what I did. I moved. It was easier than standing still. And now? He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. I'm tired of moving, he said. Something happened in Clara's chest that she was not ready to name. Then don't, she said. But if Dawes comes here looking for a fight, then I'll have a conversation with him, Ethan said. And if the conversation goes badly, I'll deal with that. But I'm not leaving Ridgeview with my tail between my legs because Roy Keller wrote a letter. He paused. Not this time. Clara looked at him. The cold air between them. The road stretching back toward town. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They walked back together. Lawrence Dawes arrived on Friday. Clara knew before she saw him the way you sometimes know a thing. Before the evidence arrives, a particular tension in the way Hattie watched the street Thursday afternoon, the way Bert Caldwell's ranch hand came through for a purchase of salt pork, and wouldn't quite meet her eyes. She was opening the bakery for morning business, pulling the front shutters wide when she heard the horse on Main Street at an hour that was not a normal hour for horses, not a working man's hour, not an errand hour, but the deliberate pace of someone who had ridden a long distance and was not in any hurry now that he'd arrived. She turned. The man on the horse was broad across the shoulders and had a face that had spent decades in weather and held the look of someone who had never in his life been told no and believed it. He was looking at her sign. Then he looked at her. Whitmore's Bakery, he said, not a question, reading it. That's right, Clara said. I'm looking for a man named Ethan Cole. I was told he frequents this establishment. His voice had the weight of a man who was accustomed to people arranging themselves around what he wanted. Clara had met men like this before. She had sold bread to men like this for 3 years. A lot of people frequent this establishment, she said. It's a bakery. He looked at her with the slightly surprised expression of a man who had expected compliance and gotten something else. You'd be the widow. I'd be Clara Whitmore, she said. Who'd you be? Lawrence Dawes. He said it like a card on a table. Clara held the door open. I've got rolls fresh out of the oven, Mr. Dawes. You're welcome to come in and buy one. Other than that, I've got a business to run. She went inside. He did not follow her. But she heard him move the horse slowly down the street, and she knew without looking that he was learning the town the way a hunter learns terrain before he starts the actual hunt. Her hands were steady when she pulled the morning rolls from the back. She was almost proud of that. She was also absolutely terrified, and she was not going to let that stop her from anything. Guy. She sent word to Ethan through Hattie, before the morning rush, just 3 words on a torn piece of paper. He is here. Hattie delivered it herself, arriving back in 20 minutes with the information that Ethan had received. It had not changed his plans, and was still intending to come at 6 o'clock as usual. He is either very brave or very stupid, Hattie said. He's neither, Clara said. He's decided. Hattie looked at her for a moment. You're rather calm about this. I'm not calm, Clara said. I'm functional. There's a difference. 6 o'clock came. Ethan came with it, boots on the step, hat in his hands, the same as every morning for the past 4 weeks. He looked no different. He sat on the step. He accepted his rolls. He's at the boarding house on 2nd Street, Clara said, coming out with her coffee. He rode the full length of Main Street this morning. He's seen the bakery. I know. Bert told me he asked around at the feed store yesterday afternoon. What did he ask? Whether I was working at the spread. Whether I was... He paused. Whether I was involved with anyone in town. The air was sharp and cold. What did Joe Faber say? Clara asked. He said I was a hired hand who bought grain on Thursdays. A pause. Joe Faber is a good man. Clara sat down. They were quiet for a moment. What does he want? She said. Really, after 9 months. Ethan turned the question over. His pride, he said at last. It was never about Nora, or not primarily. Dawes doesn't love his wife. He loves his property, and he considers her part of it. A man came onto his property. He stopped. He wants to be the man who found that other man and made him regret it. And will I watch her regret it, give him what he came for? Ethan looked at her directly. Not in the way he wants. She believed him. She was not sure if that made the situation better or worse. She was fairly sure it made it more complicated, and she'd had enough of complicated. I have something to say, she said. He waited. I don't want you to fight him. I don't want anyone on my porch step getting hurt because Roy Keller mailed a letter. And I don't want you to... She stopped, gathered herself. I don't want you to leave. The morning was extremely quiet. Clara, he said carefully, I know what I said about not being able to offer anything. I know what I said about not knowing who I am without the grief. That's all still true. She pressed her hands flat on her knees the way she always did when she was being more honest than was comfortable. But it's also true that for the first time in 14 months, I have been looking forward to 6 o'clock in the morning, and I am not going to pretend that's not true, because Lawrence Dawes decided to ride north. The silence after that was the loudest silence she could remember. Ethan set down his cup on the step beside him. He turned around properly, turned not just the half glance over the shoulder, and looked at her the way he had not let himself look at her before. Direct and unguarded. Something in his face that had been carefully managed for weeks had come loose at the edges and was showing through. You couldn't have said that any sooner, he said, and the dryness in his voice would have made her laugh if she'd trusted her voice enough. I'm saying it now, she said. I'm not leaving, he said. I want to be clear about that first. Whatever happens with Dawes, I'm not leaving. Good. And Clara, he stopped himself. What? He shook his head, put his hat on, stood up. I'm going back to work. But tonight, if you're willing, I'd like to come back and have dinner, at your table, not the step. Her heart did something significant and undeniable. I'll make soup, she said. He walked down the steps. She watched him go, and she did not pretend she wasn't watching. Lawrence Dawes appeared at her counter at 2 in the afternoon. She had been expecting it. Men like Dawes did not leave a door untried. He bought a loaf of bread, actually bought one which surprised her, and stood at the counter longer than necessary. You run this place alone, he said. I do. Since your husband died. That's correct. He looked around the bakery with the appraising gaze of a man who valued things by what they could be sold for. Cole helps you out here. He's a customer, Clara said. Same as you. He's more than a customer. Not an accusation, a statement delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had done his research. Clara set her hands flat on the counter and looked at Lawrence Dawes. She was a woman who had sat with Jasper Webb at the bank and argued property law. She was a woman who had told Roy Keller's wife to her face what her husband was. She had been managing this town, and its opinions, and its endless need to have an opinion about her life for 14 months, and she was not afraid of a rancher from Laramie with a bruised ego and a long ride. Mr. Dawes, she said, you came a long way to find a man who walked away from your property 9 months ago. That tells me something. What does it tell you? That you don't know how to let a thing go. She held his gaze. I know something about that too, about holding on because letting go feels like losing. She paused. But here's the difference. When I hold on, I'm holding on to something that loved me. When you hold on... She stopped. Let the silence finish it. He was quiet for a long moment. Where is he? He said. I don't know. Mrs. Whitmore. I genuinely don't know where he is at 2 in the afternoon, she said. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Not because I'm trying to protect him from you, he doesn't need my protection. But because you have no right to that information, and I have no obligation to give it." She handed him the loaf of bread. He had paid. She had wrapped it. The transaction was concluded. After a moment, he took it. At the door, he turned back. "He'll disappoint you," he said, not with malice, with the tired conviction of a man stating a fact. "Men like Cole always do." "Men like Cole," Clara said, "sat on my porch step every morning for 4 weeks and never once tried to manage me. You've been in my bakery for 8 minutes, and you've already tried twice." She looked at him steadily. "I'll take my chances." Dawes left. Clara released the breath she'd been holding since the bell above the door had rung his entrance. Her hands this time were not steady. They were shaking not with fear, with the aftermath of it. The particular tremor of a person who has held their nerve and is now paying the cost of it. She gripped the edge of the counter and waited for it to pass. It passed. Eggs. Ethan came for dinner as she'd said he could. She'd made vegetable soup from the root vegetables she had on hand and cornbread from the batch she'd held back from the day's baking, and she had set the table with the good dishes, not the everyday ones, the ones that came out for company. She did not examine that decision. He came in and removed his hat and stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, and she thought he looked like a man who had spent a long time outside and was not quite sure what to do with an inside. "Soup," she said, gesturing to the table. He sat down. They ate. Quietly at first, but the quiet filled with the sounds of a meal shared, rather than consumed alone, and that was a different kind of quiet entirely. She told him about Dawes coming to the bakery. She told him every word of it. When she finished, he set down his spoon. "You said all that?" he said slowly. "I did." "To Lawrence Dawes?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. That was Clara. That was not a small thing to do. "I know what it was." He looked at her across the table. The kitchen was warm. The soup was simple and good, and the cornbread was the best thing she'd baked in a week, and none of that was what either of them was thinking about. "He said you'd disappoint me," she said. "He might be right." "He might," she agreed. "I've been disappointed before. I've also been the one doing the disappointing. That's just—" She paused. "That's just people." He reached across the table. Not for her hand, he stopped short of that, his hand resting on the table near hers. An offering rather than a claim. She looked at his hand. She looked at her own. She turned her hand over. He closed his fingers around hers carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure you've earned yet. They sat like that for a long moment. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. Outside, the first snow of the season had started to fall quiet and early, and not asked for the way the best things often arrived. Clara did not know what was coming. She did not know what Dawes would do in the morning, or what Ethan's staying would cost either of them. She did not know if she had enough of herself left to give another person what love actually required, but she knew what his hand felt like in hers, and she knew she was not letting go. The snow that had started falling so quietly on Friday night did not stop until Saturday morning had nearly turned into afternoon, and when it finally relented, it left Ridgeview hushed and clean, and looking like something from a painting that had nothing to do with the actual human business being conducted inside it. Clara had not slept well, not because of fear, or not only fear. Something had changed at that kitchen table the night before, and changes, even the good kind, had a way of keeping her awake while her mind ran the edges of them, testing for weakness. She had held his hand. He had held hers. They had not kissed. They had not made promises. They had sat at her table for another hour and talked about things that had nothing to do with Dawes or debt or grief. He had told her about a horse he'd broken in his second year of ranching work. A gray mare with a mean streak and a gallop that felt like falling in the best possible way, and she had told him about the first time she'd made Thomas's mother's recipe for apple cake and gotten the proportions so wrong that Thomas had eaten the entire thing anyway and said it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. She'd laughed telling it. A real laugh, the kind that had its own momentum. He had looked at her when she laughed with an expression she hadn't known what to do with then, and still didn't in the small hours of Saturday morning. She was at the oven at 4 o'clock, same as always, but she was humming. He came at 6, and he came with news which she could tell before he opened his mouth because he was carrying a tension in his shoulders that his normal stillness didn't quite cover. "Dawes is still here," he said. "I know. He came to the spread last night, after dark." He sat on the step. He didn't reach for the rolls she'd set out. "He talked to Bert Caldwell, said he wanted to speak to me privately and Bert should arrange it." Clara felt the cold move through her. What did Bert say? Bert told him that what his hired hands did on their own time was their own business, and if Dawes wanted to talk to me, he could find me himself. A pause. Bert also told him that if he came back to the spread after dark again, he'd be introduced to both barrels of his shotgun. "Good man," Clara said with feeling. "He is." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Dawes is not going to leave. I've been thinking about this since last night, and I can't see a way around it that doesn't go through him." He looked up at her. "I need to talk to him." "I know. I don't want you anywhere near it." "I was near it yesterday," she pointed out. "In my own bakery. That was different. That was your ground." He turned to face her fully. "Clara, I need you to let me handle this. Not because you can't, you clearly can and you did. And what you said to him yesterday was..." He stopped. "It was something, but Dawes is not going to be settled by a conversation with you. He needs to hear it from me." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you going to say?" she asked. "The truth," he said. "All of it. The parts I'm not proud of, and the parts I am." He paused. "There are some parts I'm proud of. I haven't told you those yet." She waited. "Nora Dawes," he said carefully. "I told you she was unhappy. I told you she leaned on me, and I let her. What I didn't tell you is why she was unhappy." He met her eyes. Dawes hurt her, Clara. Not just with words, the way some men hurt women who can't leave. His jaw tightened. "She asked me to help her get out, to take her somewhere safe. I said no, not because I didn't care, but because I was 28 years old and terrified of what running off with a married woman would do to both of us. I thought there was a better way. I thought I could help her find family, find somewhere to go on her own." He looked down. "I was wrong. I waited too long figuring out the right way, and by the time Dawes found the letters, she'd never left, and I was the man who'd given her hope and hadn't done enough with it." The morning was very still. "So you left," Clara said. "I left her in that house," he said. "That's what I left. That's what I've been carrying." Something shifted in Clara's understanding, not a small shift, but the kind that rearranged the entire architecture. All the careful steadiness, the deliberate honesty, the way he moved through her life without taking more than she offered it, wasn't the personality of a man without ambition. It was the discipline of a man who had learned at significant cost exactly what carelessness looked like. "Did she get out?" Clara said. "Nora, after you left, did she ever..." "I don't know," he said. "That's the other thing I carry." He pressed both hands flat on his knees. "Not knowing." Clara stood up. She went inside. He heard her moving in the kitchen, not away from him, but the sounds of purposeful motion. She came back with the coffee pot and poured his cup without asking, and poured her own, and sat back down. "You're going to talk to him today," she said. "Today?" He agreed. And after, he looked at her with those gray eyes that had stopped being unreadable sometime in the last 2 weeks. "That depends on a lot of things." "One of those things being me," she said. "Yes." She wrapped both hands around her cup. Then after, she said, "You come back here." Gog. He found Lawrence Dawes at the boarding house on 2nd Street at noon. Clara did not witness the conversation. She had the bakery to run, and she ran it the way she ran everything, with her full attention and no slack in the rope. But Ridgeview was a small town, and small towns had excellent acoustics, and by 3 o'clock, She had received 3 separate reports through the reliable channel of people who needed bread and also needed to tell her things. The first report from young Danny Marsh, who delivered firewood and had been across the street, was that the 2 men had stood on the boarding house steps for 20 minutes and that nobody had raised their fists. The second report from Hattie was that Bert Caldwell had positioned himself at the end of the street and that Roy Keller had appeared and been told in no uncertain terms by 3 separate men to go home. The third report from Margaret Hale was the most interesting. "Dawes cried," Margaret said with the particular quietness of someone delivering news that had surprised them into seriousness. Danny Marsh said he could see it from the street. The big man just sat down on the step and put his face in his hands. Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Did Ethan leave?" she asked. "He sat down next to him," Margaret said. According to Danny, they sat there for another 10 minutes. Just sat. Clara turned back to the counter and kneaded the dough she was working on with rather more force than it needed. She did not know what to do with the image of Ethan Cole sitting next to the man who had ridden 9 months and several hundred miles to make his life difficult and staying. Just staying. Yes, she did. She knew exactly what to do with it. It terrified her how much she knew. The afternoon rush was heavier than usual, which she suspected had less to do with an increase in appetite and more to do with Ridgeview's collective need to have a look at her face and see whether it told them anything useful. She gave them nothing. She sold bread. She said good afternoon and thank you for coming, and she smiled when smiling was appropriate and did not when it wasn't. And when the last customer left at 5, she locked the door and stood in the quiet and waited. Ethan knocked at 5:20. Not the porch knock. The back door, the kitchen door. The one no one used except people who were expected. She opened it. He was tired in the way she recognized not the physical tiredness of work, but the tiredness of a conversation that had cost something. He had that particular weight that a person carried after they'd said every true thing they had. "Come in," she said. He did. He sat at the table. She put water on without asking. "How did it go?" she said. "He's leaving tomorrow." He rubbed one hand over his face. He's not a simple man to hate Clara. I've been trying to hate him for 9 months, and I can't fully do it." He shook his head. "He knows what he's done to Nora. I think he's known for a long time. It doesn't undo it, but he knows." "What did you say to him?" "I told him I was sorry for my part in it. I told him that what I did, letting Nora depend on me without having the courage to actually help her, was wrong. I owned it." His voice was steady, but she could hear the cost underneath it. "And then I told him that whatever he came here expecting from me, a fight, a scene, something to take home as a trophy, he wasn't getting it. Because I'm done running, and I'm done performing guilt for his benefit. I told him to go home and figure out who he wanted to be for the rest of his life." "And the crying," Clara said. He looked up sharply. "Margaret Hale," she said. "Small town." A long pause. "He's got a daughter," Ethan said quietly. 12 years old. He told me I don't know why he told me. Maybe because there was nobody else to tell. He said his daughter doesn't want to be in the same room with him, and he doesn't know how to fix it. He looked at his hands. I don't know if he can fix it, but he's going to have to try. Clara set the tea in front of him. She sat down across the table. "You sat with him," she said. "He's a person," Ethan said simply. "A bad one in a lot of ways, but still a person." She looked at this man at her kitchen table, this man who had arrived hungry on her porch step 5 weeks ago and felt the thing she had been carefully not naming move through her chest with such clean, clear force that there was no longer any pretending it was something else. She was in love with him, not the soft, gradual falling she'd had with Thomas, which had been like a river finding its course over years. This was the other kind, the kind that arrived already assembled, that you recognized rather than discovered. The kind that was terrifying precisely because it was real. She picked up her tea. She said nothing. She was not ready to say it yet, but she was done pretending it wasn't there. Roy Keller came to the bakery Sunday morning. This surprised her. Roy had never in 3 years come to her bakery on a Sunday, respecting the closed sign with the punctuality of a man who had rules about things. The closed sign was up. He knocked anyway. She nearly didn't open it. She opened it. He stood on her step with his hat in his hands, which was how she knew this was not a combative visit. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara leaned against the doorframe. "That's true." He worked his jaw. "I shouldn't have said what I said at the barber shop. About your judgment. That was ungentlemanly." "It was also wrong," she said. "It was also wrong," he agreed with visible effort. "And the letter to Dawes." He looked at the step for a moment. "That was I told myself it was the right thing. Exposing a man with a bad reputation. Protecting the town." A long pause. "I've been sitting with it since yesterday, and I think I was protecting something else. I think I was—" He stopped. "Say it, Roy." He looked up. "I think I was afraid," he said, "of change, of the town looking different than it looked when I was young, of somebody who doesn't fit the shape I decided things should be." His voice was rough with the discomfort of self-examination. "That's not a good reason." "No," Clara said. "It isn't." "I'm sorry, Clara." She looked at him. Roy Keller was not a warm man or a flexible man, but he was standing on her step in the cold on a Sunday morning with his hat in his hands, and that was something. "Don't do it again," she said. "And don't talk about my business in the barber shop unless you're talking about the bread." "Yes, ma'am." She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about the particular exhausting work of living in a small town where the same people who wronged you were also the ones you had to buy grain from and sit near in church and nod to at the Wednesday market for the rest of your natural life. She thought about how that was also, in its way, a kind of grace, the forced continuity of community, the requirement to keep being people together even after you'd failed each other. She put the kettle on. It was Sunday, her day. Ethan came Monday morning with something different in his face. Not the controlled steadiness, not the careful watching. Something looser, not careless, but lighter, the way a person looks when they have set down a weight they've been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing it was there. Dawes had left Sunday as promised. Clara had heard it from Hattie before 6 a.m., which suggested Hattie had been watching the boarding house, which Clara chose not to examine. She brought out the coffee without making a decision about it. She sat on the step, not the chair one step below him, which put them at the same level, which was new. He noticed. He said nothing about it. "He's gone," she said. "He's gone," he agreed. And I feel—" He paused, turning the word over. "I feel like ground that's been plowed, like something has been turned up that's been underneath for a long time, and now it's got to sit in the air for a while before anything can grow." She looked at the road. "I feel like that sometimes," she said. "About Thomas." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Some days I can talk about him easily, like the other night the apple cake story. And other days it's like the air is just wrong, the room is wrong, and I'm still so angry at him for dying, which is completely unfair and completely true." He turned his head to look at her. "I didn't know that," he said. "The anger, that you were angry." "I am furious," she said with a quiet fierceness that surprised even her. "I am so angry at him for getting sick, for not being careful enough, for leaving me the debt and the bakery and the whole enormous job of continuing to be a person without him." She stopped. "And I loved him completely. Both things are true, and I don't know how to hold both things except badly." Ethan was very still. "That's not badly," he said. "That's honestly." She pressed her lips together. Then she said, "I don't want to stop loving him. I'm afraid—" She stopped. Tried again. "I'm afraid that if I let something else in, it means I love him less, that I'm saying he wasn't enough, that I'm—" "Clara." His voice was quiet and certain. "That's not how it works." She looked at him. "Love isn't a fixed amount," he said. "It's not a jar that empties when you pour from it. You know that. You've known it longer than I've been sitting on your step." He looked at her directly. "You can still love Thomas completely and have room. Those aren't opposites." Her throat was tight. "You sound very sure of that," she said. "I am sure of it." A pause. "I'm sure of a lot of things I wasn't sure of 6 weeks ago." "Such as," she said. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the simple, easy intimacy of it landing like something inevitable, and said, "Such as the fact that I've been in love with you since the 3rd morning I sat on this step. And I've been trying to be patient about it because you needed time, and you still might, and I'll wait for whatever you need. But Dawes is gone, and I slept for the first time in 9 months last night, and I'm done being careful with it." The morning sat around them cold and clear and open. Clara looked at him. She thought about 14 months of survival. About the burned rolls and the bank letter and the humming that had come back before she'd realized it was gone. She thought about Roy Keller's apology and Margaret Hale's casseroles and Hattie's gossip and the whole complicated, imperfect machinery of a life being rebuilt from the inside out. She thought about the soup on Friday night and his hand around hers. She reached up and covered his hand, the one that had touched her face, with her own. "I'm not entirely done being careful," she said. "I know. But She stopped. "I'm getting there, faster than I expected." She looked at him steadily. "Don't mistake slow for no." "Never," he said. She squeezed his hand once and then let it go because she needed both hands for the coffee and the cold, and the keeping her composure, all of which were requiring her full attention simultaneously. He sat back. He picked up his rolls. He was smiling the small, genuine smile she had catalogued, without meaning to, from the very first morning, and she felt it land in the center of her chest, like the first warm day after a winter that had lasted too long. She did not look away. It was 3 days after Dawes left that the letter arrived. She found it in the afternoon mail, buried between a supply invoice and a note from her sister in Cheyenne. The return address was Laramie, Wyoming. The handwriting on the envelope was small and controlled the letters of a person who had learned to take up as little space as possible. The name in the corner was N. Dawes. Clara stood at the back desk for a long moment with the letter in her hands. Then she opened it. It was 2 pages written on plain paper in that same small, careful hand. Clara read it once, standing up, and then sat down and read it again. Nora Dawes had written to tell her that she was leaving her husband, that she had been trying to leave for 3 years and had not been able to find the courage. That a conversation she had overheard her husband have with someone in Laramie about riding north about coal, about a bakery widow in Ridgeview, had told her something she had not known before. It told me Nora had written that Ethan found somewhere worth staying. I want you to know because Lawrence will never say it, and because I owe someone the truth that Ethan Cole is not what my husband says he is. He made mistakes the same as I did. But the reason Lawrence hates him is not because of what Ethan did. It's because Ethan was the one person who ever told me I deserved better. Lawrence cannot forgive him for that. I am leaving on Thursday. I have a sister in Denver. I wanted you to know that before whatever happened up there was over. I thought you should know what kind of man was sitting on your step. Clara set the letter down on the desk. She sat in the quiet of the back room for a long moment. Then she folded the letter carefully, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to the front of the bakery and finished the rest of the day. She would show it to Ethan tonight. But she needed an hour first. An hour to sit with the particular feeling of certainty that had moved through her when she read those 2 pages. The feeling of a decision made not by the head, which could always argue itself in circles, but by some deeper place that simply knew. She had been waiting, she realized, for permission. Not from Ethan, not from the town, not from Roy Keller or Margaret Hale or Hattie Burns or any of the machinery of other people's opinions. From Thomas. She had been waiting for a sign that it was all right, that loving someone new would not be a betrayal of everything they'd built, that she was allowed finally to be more than the woman who had survived. And here it was from a stranger in Laramie who had never met her in 2 pages of small, careful handwriting, the confirmation that the man she had been falling for was exactly who she had believed he was. She pressed one hand flat over the letter in her pocket. She thought Thomas would have liked him. She thought it once, and then she let it go. Let it settle into the category of true things that did not need to be examined further. The afternoon sun came through the front window of the bakery and caught the flour dust still hanging in the air from the morning's work, and for just a moment the whole room was full of light. She showed him the letter that evening. She had intended to wait, had planned on the walk from the bakery to where she knew he'd be exactly how she would introduce it. What she would say first. How she would make it clear that she wasn't showing it to him as evidence or argument, but simply because it belonged to him as much as it belonged to her. She had prepared the whole thing in her head with the careful precision she applied to everything. Then he opened Bert Caldwell's gate, and she walked toward him, and she just held it out. He took it, read it. The evening was going dark fast, and he angled the paper toward the last of the light without moving from where he stood. She watched his face. He read it twice the same way she had, and when he looked up, his eyes were doing something complicated that he didn't try to hide. "When did this come?" he said. "This afternoon." She paused. "She's leaving him. She went to Denver." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letter again, not reading, just looking the way you look at something you've needed to know for a long time, and had stopped believing you'd ever find out. "She got out," he said. "She got out." He released a breath that sounded like it had been stored somewhere very deep for a very long time. Then he folded the letter along its original creases and held it back out to her. "Keep it," he said. "It's yours. I know what it says." His voice was steady, but something underneath it was moving. "I don't need the paper. I just needed to know." She took it back. They stood in the cold evening air, close enough that she could see the full complexity of his face. The relief and the grief that had always been braided together in him. The particular look of a man whose debt to the past had just been reduced, not erased, but reduced to something he could actually carry. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "I'm done being careful," she said. He went very still. "I told you last week, don't mistake slow for no," she said. "I'm telling you now the slow is over." She looked at him steadily. "I love you. I didn't plan to, and I don't entirely know what to do with it yet, but it's what's true, and I am tired of walking around the outside of true things." The silence lasted exactly long enough for her heart to do something acrobatic. Then he stepped forward and took her face in both hands with the careful, deliberate certainty of a man who had thought about this moment and was not going to rush it, and he kissed her. Not tentatively, not with the hedged, apologetic quality of someone who wasn't sure they had the right. He kissed her the way he did everything fully present, no part of him somewhere else, and she kissed him back and felt something in her chest that had been sealed for 14 months crack open like ground in the first thaw. When they pulled back, she was not entirely sure her legs were reliable. "I've been in love with you," he said, "since you handed me yesterday's bread through a screen door and told me you didn't need my flattery." She laughed, the real kind, the kind with momentum. "That was the first morning." "I'm aware." She pressed both hands flat against his chest. "We have a great deal to figure out." "We do," he agreed. "I'm not a simple situation." "Clara." He covered her hands with his. "Neither am I. That's not a problem." She looked up at him. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." The problem, when it arrived, came from a direction she hadn't been watching. It came the next morning, not as a person at the door, but as a conversation she overheard, which was often how the significant things arrived in a small town. She was restocking the flour from the supply delivery, the back door open for the carrying in, when she heard Bert Caldwell's voice in the alley. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to his field hand Pete about winter staffing. She heard Ethan's name. She stopped moving. "Can't keep him on past December," Bert was saying. "It's not about the work. Cole's the best hand I've had in years. It's the numbers. If this winter's as hard as last year, I need to cut 2 positions by end of month. or I'm underwater come spring." She did not hear Pete's response. She heard end of month. She heard cut 2 positions. End of month was 11 days away. She finished restocking the flour. She went back to the front of the bakery and served the morning rush with the focused efficiency she brought to everything when something was wrong that she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. She smiled when it was called for. She made change without counting twice. She said good morning and thank you for coming, and she did not let a single thing show. When Hattie came in at 10 and looked at her with the particular sharpness of a woman who read faces for sport, Clara said, "Don't," before Hattie had opened her mouth. Hattie closed her mouth. "I just need to think," Clara said. "Of course," Hattie said, and bought 2 loaves of sourdough and had the remarkable grace to leave without saying another word. She thought all morning and most of the afternoon and arrived at a conclusion she was not sure was sensible and was absolutely sure was right. When Ethan came to the back door at 5:30, his knock the kitchen knock. She let him in and put coffee on and waited until he was sitting before she said it. "Bert's letting you go end of month." He looked up. Not surprised she registered that immediately. Not surprised. "You knew," she said. "He told me yesterday." A pause. "I was going to tell you tonight." "When were you going to tell me?" "After dinner." He held her gaze. "I wasn't keeping it from you, Clara. I was ordering it. I wanted to eat dinner with you like a normal person first, and then have the conversation." She sat down across from him. "What's the conversation?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I have options. There's a spread in Montana that Bert knows the owner of. He offered to write me a letter. Good winter work through to April." He paused. "And there's a man in Cheyenne who runs a livestock operation and heard about me through somebody. He's looking for a full-time foreman, year-round position. It's a good offer." Cheyenne was 180 miles south. The kitchen was very quiet. "Both of those require leaving," she said. "Yes." She looked at her hands, then at him. "Are you considering them?" "I'm telling you they exist," he said carefully. "I'm not telling you I want them." "What do you want?" He met her eyes. "You know what I want." "I need you to say it." "I want to stay in Ridgeview," he said. "I want to walk up your porch steps every morning and drink coffee on the step and eat the best bread in Wyoming and figure out slowly, or not so slowly, what this is between us." He paused. "But I'm not a man who sits idle, and I won't be kept, Clara. If I'm in Ridgeview with no work, I'm a man with no standing and nothing to offer, and I won't be that." The truth of that landed with the weight of something she had known was coming and had been preparing for without realizing it. She took a breath. "I have a proposal," she said. He waited. "The bakery needs a delivery route," she said. "I've known it for 2 years. There are 4 ranches within 8 miles that would buy bread and rolls 3 times a week if someone would bring it to them, but I can't manage the baking and the delivery both. I've been losing that income because I don't have the hours." She kept her voice businesslike. "I also need someone to handle the supply runs to the mill in Greeley once a month, 2 days there and back heavy loading. I've been paying Joe Faber's boy to do it, and he's unreliable." She looked at him directly. "I can't pay what Bert was paying, but I can pay fair, and I can increase the root income as it builds, and it's real work, not charity." He looked at her for a long moment. "You thought this through," he said. "I thought this through." "When?" "Between the flour delivery and the morning rush." The corner of his mouth moved. "Clara," he said. "It makes business sense," she said before he could make it into something else. "I need the help. You need the work. Those are facts." "They are." He tilted his head. "And the other part," she said evenly, "is that I would like you to stay in Ridgeview, and this is how that becomes possible. And I am proposing it because it is the right thing, and not because I need—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "I am not good at needing things out loud." "I know." "I need you to stay," she said. It came out quiet and undecorated, and it cost her something real. That's the other part. He did not answer immediately. He sat with it the way he sat with everything, giving it the full weight it deserved. Then he said, "When do I start?" She felt the relief move through her so fast it was almost dizzying. "Monday," she said. "I need to talk to the ranches first. Let them know." "Monday," he agreed. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Across the table, something had shifted into place with the quiet rightness of a well-made joint, 2 pieces cut to fit each other, settling flush. It was Hattie who told the town. Clara had not asked her to. Hattie simply had the gift of distributing accurate information faster than inaccurate information spread on its own, and she deployed this gift generously and without being asked throughout the week. By Wednesday, the 4 ranch spreads had each confirmed their order. By Thursday, Joe Faber was asking Clara with the cautious diplomacy of a man losing a contract if there was still a need for his son on the supply run. "Not from February," Clara said. "I'll give you to the end of January." Joe Faber nodded as if he'd expected this and left without complaint. Margaret Hale appeared Friday morning with a pound cake she said was left over from the church social, which was true in the way that many of Margaret's stories were true, technically accurate, and strategically deployed. "I'm glad he's staying," Margaret said, setting the cake on the counter with the air of a woman completing a long project. "He's working the delivery route," Clara said. "Yes, of course." Margaret smiled with a serenity that suggested she knew perfectly well that was not the complete sentence. "The delivery route." "Don't," Clara said, but she was smiling when she said it. Margaret Hale left, looking thoroughly satisfied with the state of the world. The first delivery run went out Monday morning in the cold and came back by noon with payment from 3 of the 4 ranches and a standing order from the 4th, starting the following week. Ethan set the money on her counter without ceremony and reported the route conditions and the condition of the roads and which approach to the Henderson's spread was passable in deep snow and which was not. She wrote it all down. He watched her write. "You're efficient," he said. "I run a business. You run it well." She looked up from the ledger. "You're going to have to stop saying complimentary things to me in the middle of the workday, or I'm going to lose my train of thought." "I'll note that for future reference," he said. She went back to the ledger. He stayed at the counter longer than the report required. "Ethan." "Yes." "You have flour deliveries to unload." "I do," he agreed and went to do them. She pressed her hand flat on the open ledger page and allowed herself briefly and privately to feel the full weight of what was happening, the particular sensation of a life reassembling itself around new architecture. Not the life she'd had, not a lesser version of it. Something different and real and entirely its own. It did not feel like betrayal. It felt like continuing. The twist came the way the real ones always did, quietly in the middle of an ordinary day, from a direction she hadn't been watching. She was alone in the bakery on Thursday afternoon when a woman came in she didn't recognize. Thin mid-30s with the careful economy of movement that Clara had come to associate with people who had spent a long time making themselves small. She had a traveling bag. She stood at the counter and looked at Clara. "You're Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "I am." Clara looked at her, looked at the bag, felt the recognition arrive before the name did. "I'm Nora Dawes," the woman said. The bakery was entirely still. "I was on my way to Denver," Nora said. "I got as far as Cheyenne before I don't know why I came north instead. I've been on the train for 2 days, telling myself it was foolish and doing it anyway." She looked at Clara with the directness of someone who had spent a long time looking away from things and had decided to stop. "I needed to say something to someone, and the only person I could think of was the woman who was keeping him." Clara set down the bread knife she'd been holding. "He doesn't know you're here," she said. "No." Nora shook her head. I'm not here for him. I wrote him what I needed to say. I'm here for you." She paused. I needed to tell you face to face that he is a good man. That what happened was—" She stopped, tried again. "I was desperate, and he was kind, and I took his kindness further than he meant it to go. He tried to help me. He handled it badly. But his heart was right." She looked at Clara steadily. "Some women don't find out until it's too late what a right heart looks like. I wanted you to know you found one." The silence was long and full. Clara came around the counter. She pulled out the chair by the wall, the one she kept for customers who needed to sit, and she looked at Nora Dawes. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea." Nora blinked. "You came a long way," Clara said simply. "You'll sit for a few minutes before you go back to the station." Something in Nora's face came apart very slightly at the edges, the particular look of a woman who had been braced for less than she received. She sat down. Clara put the kettle on. They drank tea together for 20 minutes. Two women who had arrived at the same man from entirely different directions, and had both in their different ways been changed by the experience. They did not say everything. They said enough. When Nora left, she was carrying a wrapped loaf of sourdough that Clara pressed into her hands without asking, and a piece of paper with her sister's address in Cheyenne in case Denver didn't work out, or Denver needed supplementing. "You don't have to do that," Nora said. "I know I don't," Clara said. "Be well, Nora." Nora walked out the door and down the street and out of the story the same way she'd come into it, quietly, without ceremony, a woman in the middle of finding out who she was going to be. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her go. Then she went back inside and finished the afternoon. She told Ethan that evening at the kitchen table over soup that was better than the first soup because she was no longer nervous, and better ingredients made a difference, but so did a steadier hand. She told him everything. Word for word, the way she told him all things. He was quiet through most of it. When she finished, he put his spoon down and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, with the expression of a man processing something too large to respond to quickly. "She came here," he said. "She did. For you. She said she needed to say it to a person." He shook his head slowly. "That took—" He stopped. "That took courage." "It did." Clara paused. "I gave her my sister's address. In case she needs someone." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was beyond what she had words for, a kind of fullness, the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was going and finds it is exactly right. "You gave the woman who—" He stopped again. "I gave a woman who was alone your sister's address." Clara met his eyes. That's all it was. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. They held on in the warm kitchen with the smell of the soup and the last of the day fading through the window, and the whole ordinary, extraordinary business of two people learning each other spread out before them like a road that went as far as they were willing to walk. November settled into Ridgeview with the permanence of a guest who intended to stay through spring, and the town settled around its new shape, the way towns did not all at once, not without friction, but steadily. The delivery route grew. By the third week, Ethan had added 2 more stops, and Clara had begun keeping a second ledger for the route income alone. The numbers were not large, but they were consistent, and consistency, she had learned, was worth more than occasional abundance. Roy Keller bought bread every Tuesday and said good morning without editorializing. Margaret Hale stopped bringing casseroles and started buying rolls. Hattie Burns remained Hattie Burns, which was both inevitable, and Clara had come to accept a kind of gift. Bert Caldwell stopped Ethan on the road one Thursday and said without preamble that if he ever wanted to come back to the spread on a seasonal basis, there would always be a place. Ethan said he appreciated it. They shook hands. That was that. December brought snow that was serious about its intentions, and the delivery route required adjustments, and some mornings required earlier starts. And one Tuesday required Ethan to dig out the Henderson's approach road before he could make the delivery, which put him back an hour and left him red-faced with cold and entirely unbothered by any of it. Clara had come to understand a man who was at peace with hard work. Not in the way some men were at peace with it, performing the endurance of it, expecting credit. He simply worked the way she simply baked, with the focused attention of someone who found dignity in the thing itself. She watched him come back from the Tuesday run and unload the empty crates and brush the snow off his coat at the back door, and she felt the love for him as a clean, uncomplicated thing. Not painless. Love was not painless, but clear. The way the air is clear after a storm has blown through and taken all the ambiguity with it. "Bad roads," she said. "Nothing the horse couldn't handle." He hung up his coat. "Henderson wants to add a Friday order, his wife's birthday. Tell her I'll do the apple cinnamon loaf." She paused. "Ethan?" He looked up. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, just that quick and certain, with both hands on his face, and then stepped back and went to the stove to check the afternoon batch. He stood where she'd left him for a moment, looking like a man who had been handed something he'd stopped expecting. "I'll tell her," he said at last, his voice slightly different from usual. "Good," she said. On the last Sunday of November, her day, Thomas's rule, the one she kept sacred, Clara sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the morning and opened the old ledger. The one with Thomas's handwriting in the front pages, the careful column of numbers from the first year of the bakery, his notes in the margins about which suppliers were reliable and which needed watching. She ran her finger along his writing. She did not cry. She had done her crying, the kind that needed doing, and what was left was not grief. Exactly. It was love without a destination, which was different. Love that had nowhere to land, and had simply become part of how she moved through the world. She thought about what Ethan had said. Love isn't a fixed amount. It's not a jar that empties when you pour from it. She believed that now. She had believed it. She thought from the moment he said it. It was the kind of true thing that lands already understood, like recognizing a word you've always known in a language you didn't know you spoke. She closed the old ledger and opened the new one. The clean pages, the fresh numbers, the delivery route, and the bank repayment, and the flour costs, and the growing column of income that was for the first time in 14 months moving in the right direction. She picked up her pen. Outside, the Sunday silence of Ridgeview settled around the bakery like something familiar. No boots on the step this morning. That was the agreement without either of them having to say it. He had his Sundays, she had hers. The shape of two people who understood that love did not require constant presence, that solitude and togetherness were not opposites but partners. She liked that about him. She liked everything about him, which was a thought she no longer fought. "Yeah, cool." When the church bell rang 10 o'clock, she heard the gate. She was at the window before she'd made the decision to be. He was standing on the other side of the fence, not coming through it, just standing there with his hat in his hands, the way he'd stood on the very first morning, and she understood immediately that he was asking without asking, "Is this still your day? Do you still need it?" She opened the window. "The gate," she said, "is not locked." He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the gate and came up the walk, and she went to the door and let him in, and they sat together at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with the cold outside and the warmth inside, and the whole long, unfinished, luminous work of a life being lived, not survived, not managed, but actually fully lived, spread out before them, like the best kind of bread made from simple things, requiring patience and worth every bit of the waiting. That was the truth of it. That was all of it. Clara Whitmore had started humming again, and this time she did not stop.